But thank you for being here today, and it's really an honor to be speaking in front of you. I have to say that as grateful as I am to be here, I have to confess that if, say, a year and a half ago, anyone had said that I would be standing in front of you today, I wouldn't have believed them for a second. The truth is, until recently, I was one of those people whose eyes would glaze over at a term like health privacy, a term that seemed far removed from the daily concerns of my family. Then, the CEO of a large American company, my husband's employer, publicly blames my daughter's medical bills for a cut in employee benefits. He attached a price tag to my daughter's life, and he disclosed details that allowed my husband's coworkers to immediately identify our family. He used a phrase, distress babies, that set off a national firestorm. And it was only as the firestorm subsided that I finally began to understand what's at stake for all of us in the issue of health privacy, protecting our basic rights as workers, citizens, and human beings. Let me try to explain an event that will remain somewhat inexplicable. In October 2012, I was just 5.5 months pregnant when I suddenly woke up in pain. My pregnancy had been completely uncomplicated, and I just couldn't believe that I could be in labor. By the time I got to the hospital, the baby's heartbeat was slowing, and the doctors had to perform an emergency C-section. My daughter was resuscitated, attached to machines, and enclosed in a little glass box. She weighed 1 pound 9 ounces. Her ears were barely formed. Her face and body were obscured by tubes and wires. Her skin was reddish purple. One doctor described it as gelatinous. Another doctor referred to her birth as catastrophic. The grim odds for her future, her odds of dying or surviving with serious disabilities, overshadowed her tenuous existence. Yet I had no choice but to cling to hope. When I reached into her incubator for the first time, her tiny hand held onto mine. Hour after hour, I watched my daughter fight for her life. Day by day, I learned how to be the mother of a child for whom nothing was guaranteed, not even the next breath. During her 3-month stay in the NICU, my daughter fought her way back from a severe brain hemorrhage, a collapsed lung, and more procedures and diagnoses than I can list, all direct consequences of the plain fact that she had arrived long before she was ready. But when she was discharged from the hospital, she looked like any other newborn, if tinier than most. Over the next months, as she smiled and rolled over and babbled right on cue, everyone called her a miracle child. But the circumstances of her birth still hung over me like a terrible secret. None of the doctors could explain why my pregnancy had ended so abruptly. I never had any risk factors for preterm birth. My first child, my son, had been born not only in perfect health, but on his actual due date. I had unthinkingly subscribed to the notion that a woman can do everything right to have a healthy baby. So I couldn't shake the sense that I must have done something terribly wrong to cause my daughter premature birth. I simply didn't know how to accept the stark reality that in pregnancy, as in life, sometimes disaster strikes without warning and without reason. By the time my daughter reached her developmental age of 1 year, she played peekaboo, said mama, and snatched toys from her big brother. Then she took her first steps, 2 tiny, earth-shaking steps, and I finally began to allow myself to believe that she had defied the odds. That same week, last February, Tim Armstrong, the CEO of AOL, held a town hall meeting where he was pressed to explain why he had made cuts to the retirement savings plan when the company had just posted its best earnings in years. 2 things that happened in 2012, he said. 2 employees had distressed babies that were born that we paid $1 million each to make sure those babies were okay in general. And those are the things that add up into our benefits cost. My husband immediately began fielding queries from coworkers. Wasn't the CEO talking about our baby? Even as the phrase distressed babies became fodder for countless headlines and ironic tweets, I went into shock and denial, telling myself that this corporate blunder had nothing to do with me and my family. But I found myself cowering inside my own house, unable to look at my daughter without reliving her most perilous moments, and overcome by shame and guilt and fear all over again. The next day, as the firestorm raged on, Tim Armstrong issued a clarification that he had only been trying to explain how the company goes above and beyond for its employees by citing, as one example, high-risk pregnancies. To me, this statement finally made explicit the judgment implicit in his original comments, that my daughter must have been a risky proposition from the start and therefore her care was optional, that the medical treatment that saved her life was not a basic right or even a contractual obligation, but an act of corporate charity. And that very term, distressed babies, implied that my daughter was comparable to distressed merchandise or damaged goods. Despite pressure from my husband's direct boss, Ariana Huffington, to keep quiet, I felt compelled to speak out to defend my daughter's basic humanity. In an essay published in Slate, I told the story of my daughter's birth for the first time. The story went viral, Armstrong apologized, and I forgave him. But then, as the firestorm subsided, I found myself reading an outpouring of messages from strangers across the country who called upon me to recognize that Tim Armstrong had exposed much more than my family's trauma. One of those strangers was a woman many of you know, Deborah Peel, the founder of Patient Privacy Rights. At first, I was completely baffled by her emails with all the references to personal health data and IT health systems. My family's ordeal still seemed so personal to me that I couldn't quite grasp the larger significance of the controversy, even when she summarized it for me this way: every employer can do what Tim Armstrong did to you. When I finally agreed to meet her, as some of you know, Deborah Peel is nothing if not persistent. She told me that she saw me and my daughter as the embodiment of the threats surrounding the health privacy of all Americans. I was still dubious. Of course, I'd heard the dire warnings from experts about our imperiled right to privacy in the digital era. Warnings I used to shrug off as they seemed far removed from the daily concerns of my family. After all, I appreciated unsolicited reminders to reorder diapers from Amazon and Google's automated directions to an appointment in my calendar. While I felt vague unease at the idea of having my phone records logged or my geolocation tracked, I figured that as long as I had no plans to threaten national security, I had no real reason to worry. But as I continued to sift through the emails pouring into my inbox, I was forced to recognize a massive blind spot. A mother of premature twins told me she still cries every time she recalls how the insurance rep at her husband's employer announced an increase in rates, quote, because last year someone had the nerve to have twins that cost the company a lot of money. Another mother wrote to tell me that her husband had been suddenly fired over the phone right after he told his employer that one of their unborn daughters was unlikely to survive while the other faced a perilous prognosis. A woman with a diagnosis of cancer described how she forced herself to work through rounds of surgery and chemotherapy only to be fired and accused of taking the job only for the health insurance. Despite her PhD, she now faces the prospect of being homeless. Previously, I might have dismissed such tales as heartbreaking but anomalous incidents. But now I came to see that these stories are representative of a gaping vulnerability confronting millions of American families. The threat of having our personal health information used against us by cost-cutting employers. Wherever we stand on Facebook's privacy policies or the NSA surveillance programs, we can all agree that our medical records contain highly sensitive personal information, whether they include details of a pregnancy, a cancer diagnosis, anxiety medication, a heart condition, a sexually transmitted disease, testing for the Alzheimer's gene, family history of mental illness, or a child's ADHD. Few ordinary Americans would shrug off the idea of our bosses readily accessing such information about ourselves and our families without our knowledge or permission. But that is, in fact, our current reality. Half of all Americans depend upon employers for health insurance, over 150 million of us. Over the last few decades, healthcare costs have risen exponentially, just as much of corporate America has become relentlessly focused on cutting labor costs. This fundamental and growing tension has motivated many employers to closely monitor employees' health. Companies that choose to self-insure, such as AOL, directly amass employees' health data, which they own. Companies that still use outside insurance carriers often ask employees to authorize the disclosure of their health information. Most employees likely sign off without much thought and without much of a choice, the same way most of us sign those privacy notices at doctors' offices. In the midst of the distressed babies controversy, many observers invoked the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, HIPAA. And I had taken some comfort in learning that Armstrong's disclosure did indeed qualify as a legal violation. But what I now learned was that while HIPAA was partly intended to protect patient privacy in the dawning age of electronic data, it was effectively gutted 6 years after its inception, when the administration of George W. Bush eliminated the rule that healthcare providers must obtain consent from individuals before using or disclosing their health information. Since then, what few Americans know is that those privacy notices at doctors' offices provide nothing more than the illusion that our medical records are private. Whether or not we sign, our medical records, complete from birth to death, are available to a plethora of profit-seeking entities, such as banks, pharmaceutical companies, marketing firms, and our employers. By law, those records are supposed to be anonymized, but as Distressed Babies demonstrated, names don't have to be named in order for highly sensitive information to be easily traced to specific individuals, especially in any workplace. Furthermore, the law serves as a distinctly mild deterrent to plenty of cost-cutting employers. In one chilling survey, 35% of Fortune 500 employers admitted to looking at employees' health records before making hiring and promotion decisions. The damage of health privacy violations might seem abstract until it happens to you. Among the ordinary Americans who wrote to me to share their stories, the experience of being targeted as deplorable burdens by their employers seemed to be one of the most painful parts of their ordeals to retell, as painful as the medical emergencies, the perilous prognoses, even the suffering of their children. The exposure of physical and psychological trauma, the breaching of interpersonal boundaries, the shame, fear, and guilt that often linger in the aftermath of medical crises, the power that employers wield over employees whose families depend upon their paychecks and their health insurance policies. For people terminated from their jobs at the most vulnerable time in their lives, the damage could hardly be more devastating. All of which also makes most victims of health privacy violations feel utterly helpless to fight back. Among the people who wrote to me, not one of them sought legal recourse, no matter how blatant the violation. My family was comparatively fortunate. My daughter is now a healthy toddler whose care was mostly covered by employer-sponsored insurance. My husband was able to leave AOL on his own terms in the wake of the controversy. But millions of working Americans are more exposed than ever. Current legal protections include HIPAA as well as the Americans with Disabilities Act and state tort laws. But technology has outstripped the protections of the law. We have no right of consent over our medical records and therefore no control. Meanwhile, employers have an arsenal of plausibly deniable means of discriminating against defenseless employees, shaming, reassigning, concocting reasons for sudden termination. How many of us can truly feel protected in a system where we are vulnerable to such treatment the moment we suffer a stroke of misfortune? Not long ago, after the firestorm died down, I stumbled across this headline in the New Yorker: "Whose distressed baby is it?" Even then, my immediate reaction was to feel ashamed of myself and my own child. But the columnist was using that query to make a larger point. What are we risking as a country when we price a child that way? Whose distressed baby is it? She's mine, of course, and I wouldn't have it any other way, but what I've come to understand is that she is all of our children too. Over the last year, I wrote a memoir, Girl in Glass, to explore the broader ramifications of my daughter's journey. I also recently founded a site, ourdistressedbabies.org, to honor all the stories that people have shared with me and to allow others who have suffered similar ordeals to speak out. It's my hope that sharing our stories will be an important first step in bringing more compassion and justice to our healthcare system. But there is so much more that needs to be done. That's why I applaud all of you for the work that you are doing and the mission that has brought us here this morning. Health privacy in the workplace is far from a philosophical matter, but a crucial issue of civil rights in America today. Without the right to health privacy, working Americans will remain at the mercy of corporations that can't always resist the call of higher profits at the expense of basic humanity. Thank you. Okay, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions.
I want to thank you. Let me thank her so much. It really is brave, and I think you know this and you can hear this in her voice, to be able to talk about these matters in such a public way, but it is crucial. And I think you're absolutely right. The point that these are civil rights and human rights is really overlooked today. And how are we doing? Question?
I just want to say thank you to Deborah Peel for opening my eyes to an issue that I really was not aware of until I lived through this.
Bill Yesnop, health IT consultant. Deanna, thank you so much for having the courage to open up and share this difficult time that you had. This is an audience of mostly fierce privacy advocates, of which you are now one. But I think you would agree that before this happened to you, this really wasn't an issue that was terribly important to you. You said in your talk you really didn't understand it. So I wonder, not being a privacy advocate and having made the transition, I wonder if you had any thoughts or ideas about how all of us can more effectively explain these issues and open eyes of people who are not paying attention to this. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a great question. I mean, I think the debates that you have within your own community, our community, I guess I should say, are hugely important also, and I don't mean to minimize the importance of philosophical, ethical debates. I do think that for most ordinary Americans, you know, the talk of privacy tends to sound extremely abstract, and it is hard to sort of get over that barrier. I think that in the area of health privacy, once you start naming conditions that people can immediately connect to themselves and their families, their children, their grandchildren, then I think people start to get it. And I also think that when it's brought to an area of social justice and discrimination, then people can also immediately get the stakes here. I do think that in this current climate where health costs are often seen as a kind of zero-sum game, which is, you know, a much broader problem, that it's very easy for people to say, well, that's not my problem, you know, until you've gone through something where, you know, you needed costly medical care. I think it's easy for people to say, you know, that's the kind of thing that wouldn't happen to me, because of course none of us wants to acknowledge the reality that we're all vulnerable to suffering a medical crisis. So I think that's also kind of another hump to get over. But I do think particularly maybe with women's issues, with pregnancy, with, and again, anything that has to do with our families, our children, then I think people can more easily have a personal connection to the issues. And you know, it is my hope that I can do, you know, my part in humanizing these issues, and that if I can speak up and if I can allow others who wrote to me to speak up, then that will allow others to do the same. Because I think one of the most eye-opening aspects of this experience has been how profoundly isolating it feels to be exposed in that way. And you kind of can't believe that other people have gone through the same thing. Even when I was getting all these emails from people, I still couldn't quite see it as an issue of medical privacy until Deborah Peel really broke it down for me. I mean, I think I kept thinking of it like, whoa, that's a really nasty CEO, and that was really unfair. And I think people can more easily connect to that just basic question, like that wasn't fair, that was a violation. And then when you start taking to, and then from there, then I think you can bring it more to larger questions of health privacy.
Adrian Gropper, Patient Privacy Rights. Thank you so much for your courage also. The question I have is, in the work you've done around this in the past year, and the fact that you started out linking what happened to profit. It wasn't another kind of crime. It wasn't a crime or a harm per se meant at you. These are not criminals in any sense of the word. Is there a broader understanding of the way we deal with health and health privacy in our country, in this unique system that we have that's very highly privatized, that you would draw because of the importance of profit in both the insurance and the delivery side, as well as other aspects, maybe political, et cetera?
That's a great question. I mean, to be perfectly honest, when the whole distressed baby controversy broke out, I think there was a part of me that felt like, you know, maybe I don't have a right to complain. My daughter's care did cost a lot of money. When I started doing the digging, it seems like the $1 million number was chosen for effect and was a huge exaggeration. But having put that aside, there's no question that my daughter's care cost the company a lot of money, and there's no question that you know, someone who suffers a spinal cord injury, someone who gets hit by a car, their care would cost a lot of money too. And I think also in the issues surrounding premature babies, there often is this sometimes unspoken question about, you know, is this person going to be a burden on society? Is this person going to justify the costs of their medical bills? So I think these are very real issues. In the context of AOL, which, you know, I'm using not to vilify the company or the CEO, but because I think this instance is actually pretty representative of a lot of stories like this. I think because employee benefits are often portrayed as though it has to be a zero-sum game, you know, my daughter's health care has to take away from somebody else, then I think it's very easy for people to feel like, well, you know, once you're talking about dollars and cents, is your right to privacy really more important than my 401k? Yeah. In this case, what I come to see is that, you know, there's no inherent reason why retirement benefits and healthcare spending have to be pitted against each other, especially in a profitable company. And the truth is, there was no real zero-sum game, except in terms of the CEO's bonus, which was actually specifically tied to his ability to cut costs. And, you know, employees' medical expenditures. So I think, again, you know, just like health privacy was never an issue that ignited my personal passions, neither was healthcare reform. And I think it's hard to start talking about these issues without getting into a place where we start questioning, well, why do we depend upon our employers for health insurance, especially when our employers are, of course, profit-seeking entities. I do think that there are, you know, moral, compassionate ways to run a company where there's an understanding that we offer benefits because that's what we do and people are supposed to use them. because that's what they're there for. And we have to structure that health insurance in a way that accepts that in any given year, somebody could get hit by a car, somebody could have a heart attack, somebody could have a premature baby. These are givens in life. These are risks that are extraordinary for any individual family, but they are completely predictable in the aggregate, and that's the point of health insurance. So I don't think that the employer model necessarily has to be done away with. And in fact, I've talked to people who say, well, the thing is, once you're joining a pool where you're relying just on private insurers, if anything, private insurers have more of an incentive to just look for the high-cost individuals and somehow find a way to kick them off. So, you know, I think universal health care is a model where people don't have to be pitted against one another, and you know, whatever the downsides and the trade-offs, there's something to be said for the fact that in a system like that, no individual has to be seen as having, you know, been a burden on everyone else, and the pool is large enough that no baby's medical bills affect any other anyone else, and also where the costs of care are not as staggeringly expensive as they are in the United States, which is not it's not the fault of any individual patient, of course, but is the fault of the American healthcare industry. So I think that's I think where the discussion has led me, at least in my own thinking.
Right, thank you so much. Just about the legality, so I was wondering, did the CEO know who the two employees were who had the distressed babies? Right. And are there any protections if a company is self-insured? Is the CEO technically allowed to know that, or is that a violation of law of some sort?
Sure. I mean, I will try to speak to that to the extent that I can, and feel free to jump in if I'm missing any of the technicalities. No one knows, other than Tim Armstrong and his inner circle, exactly what he knew. We only know what he disclosed. What he disclosed was enough for my family to be identified. So that in itself means that it's a HIPAA violation. I will say that even in a company of 5,000 employees, he might have thought that, well, what I'm saying is generally enough that, you know, it doesn't have to be traced to any specific individuals. Even in that moment, if he didn't have my husband in his mind when he was saying those words, you know, in any workplace, he's had close enough contact that he knew that my husband had to take a week off when our daughter arrived. He knew that that when my husband came back to work, there were hospital visits and things like that. So, you know, whatever he knew in that moment, it's certainly a very, very fine line, if there is one, between, you know, knowing what, even if he knew only what he said in that moment, it was very, very easy for him to know much more at any point. And I'm sorry, the second part of your question was?
Well, just like, is it lawful for a
Right.
health insurance company to tell a CEO that? Because the CEO could have used it in other ways,
Sure.
hiring, firing.
I mean, it seems to me by law only someone whose work directly pertains to the healthcare plan, such as human resources managers, should have access to that data, and also that data can only be used or disclosed for a permitted purpose, and certainly justifying the CEO's cost-cutting at a company meeting is not a permitted purpose. But it also seems like the law is written broadly enough that in any given workplace, the CEO could easily get his hands on that information, and feel free to jump in.
No, it's true. There are some prohibitions even for self-insured companies, but in practice, like Deanna's heard, we've heard many, many examples of companies with outside separate plans, not you know, that are supposed to be really separate from the company, and they still get the information. So, you know, the problem is it's leaky, it's not monitored, there's really no checks and balances, and no one's going to tell you. Like, Deanna's not absolutely sure that he looked at their records, but she's made a strong case that they could have, and he knew plenty just from what was revealed. And so it's a leaky system, and the HR people are also often leakers to executives because they work for them. So it's just not designed for privacy. The other thing that I think is so important that she's emphasizing is how much our particular system in the U.S. ends up demonizing the patients. You know, the guilt and the shame that you feel as if you've done something wrong. Okay, humans, what happens when you're alive? Eventually, sooner or later, you will have health problems. We aren't going to make it, and you know, we're all going to die. We're going to get sick. We're going to have health problems. It's part of life. It's not something that we should be blamed for. And the points about universal insurance and so on are very clear. We have people here from Europe I hope you'll talk to, but in Europe, no one's blamed for high health care costs. I mean, it's like blaming the victim. But we all have bodies, and things go wrong with our bodies. That's part of life. It's not like a fault or some defect that we've created for ourselves. That's crazy. I mean, illness is part of life, and the blaming of people, the same people that are blamed in this country are not blamed in other countries because there aren't skyrocketing costs. How convenient. I mean, even terms like lifestyle diseases. I'm sorry, I'm a physician. I don't think anyone chooses a lifestyle of being ill. They just don't. And so, but the whole language is about blaming and shaming, and it's really terrible. We're being blamed for being human beings when we're I don't know, maybe you could say even much like technology, we do break down and don't work sometimes. So.
Hi, Melinda Beck from the Wall Street Journal. I'm curious, both from you and maybe anybody else in the audience too, is there a way to fix this, short of going to a European system or short of ending employer health insurance? Because it sounds like, leaky as they are, the laws are in place. Would somehow giving patients more control over their health information and where it goes have prevented this, or is that even possible in an employer insurance world?
Yeah, thanks, Melinda, and thanks for being here. Yeah, we think there are solutions, and we do think that putting people back in control of their information is the first step. I mean, at least in the paper world, you had a piece of paper that you signed that said, send my information to this hospital or that doctor. So, you know, we had accountability, and the movement of our information was transparent. We no longer have transparency or accountability. And you might know this. In the stimulus bill, 2009, we got in a provision, thanks to many of you and our allies in the Bipartisan Coalition for Patient Privacy, we got in a right to an accounting for disclosures of every time your information was sent out for treatment, payment, or healthcare operations. It is now, I'm trying to count, 6 years later. There's no regs. We can't even find out who our information in our electronic records has been disclosed to. And that's because industry is really afraid of how many disclosures there are. In a typical hospital visit, there will be 100 or so humans that look at your records, but thousands of electronic systems checking and looking at and using the records. And that's important information for us to know. Where's the data? But yeah, with control, then they would have to ask first, and then we could limit some of the places that it goes that really have no bearing on our health or our well-being or any relation to us.
And could that include an employer that was paying the bills ultimately? Or, well, I mean, there are walls there supposedly, but they're not being honored, I guess.
I believe there's very few situations in which an employer needs to know something about an employee's health. Okay, pilots, train engineers, physicians, anesthesiologists, I think maybe we ought to know if they're on drugs. The rest of us, not so much. You know, if you're doing drugs and your performance fails, they can tell that you don't belong there because your performance fails. They don't have to monitor your whatever chemicals are in your blood all the time. I mean, all this drug monitoring, there are certain situations where lives are at stake, where there should be a higher standard, and you might have to give up some privacy. But in most places of employment, they don't actually need to know your health information. They need to know, are you a good worker, do you have skills, and are you doing your job?
And I just want to bring that back a little bit to the real life people who wrote to me. I mean, I think if a lot of these people had been able to see, oh, my boss accessed my medical records at that time that I got this diagnosis, at least they would have a way of making sense of what happened, of protecting themselves to some degree, and at least being aware of how that information was used against them. As it is, all they have is this sense of shame and guilt and fear and exposure without actually knowing how they've been exposed. And I think what I'm about to say might also seem maybe simplistic and naive, but working within the existing models, I mean, I don't think it's that much of a leap, although for some CEOs it might be, just to see your employees as human as anyone else. And I think the only way some of this corporate accounting makes sense is if you're not viewing your employees that way. I mean, I think if Tim Armstrong had just simply taken a moment to say, well, what if that was my baby? What if that was my child? What if that was my wife? Would I want anyone to stand up in front of a room and announce that to 5,000 employees? No, of course not. And I think also a sincere apology right after the fact could have done a lot to, help both my family and also the other family whose information was exposed by his disclosure.
Deb, you might want to comment on the lack of enforceability of HIPAA via private action, because this, in fact, what happened is already against the law. So the problem is that the law is not enforced, and you, Deanna, have absolutely no opportunity to go anywhere except to the Office of Civil Rights to complain. You can't file a suit, et cetera. So, Deb?
Yeah, that's true. Although, anybody here a federal employee? Federal employees do have a right to sue. And so that's why when there was a breach a couple of years ago, you might remember a big VA breach, they were able to have a class action suit because they have a right to sue to protect themselves. So that is an important point. We have to depend on the Office of Civil Rights, and later today, Jocelyn Samuels, the new director, is going to be here to talk about her approach to that. But I think most of us feel that the Office of Civil Rights hasn't prosecuted anything, but part of what's a misunderstanding is the breaches that happen, what most patients think of as breaches, like their information being shared with someone they don't think should have it, are not breaches because they're legally allowed. So people are complaining to the Office of Civil Rights for something that's allowed. Your information can be shared by the data holder for treatment, payment, or healthcare operations. And again, in a self-insured plan, the business can see all the records. And so there are clearly legal protections that we need to try to fix. Yes.
And just on a personal level, I mean, I can say that, my husband and I consider ourselves pretty savvy, educated people. And when we were in this situation, we just couldn't have felt more incapable of figuring out any legal means of rectifying the situation. It just, going into a court of law seemed like the last thing that we would want to do, reliving everything. I mean, none of that really felt doable for us. And I think, just hearing from all the people who had suffered similar experiences, it seemed to be, across the board, the word that kept coming up again and again and again was this word shame. I felt such shame. And, that was really just so eye-opening to me, because I think for me, all of this was so wrapped up in, as a mother, as a pregnant woman, all the things that, you can fail to do. But hearing that same word from people who had suffered, cancer diagnoses or, any kind of medical crises, and then made to feel like a burden, shame is what keeps them silent.
Mark Rothstein, I have a few short comments. One is that employers are not covered entities under the HIPAA privacy rule, and most of the privacy violations, in terms of health privacy violations, by employers are actually litigated under the Americans with Disabilities Act that has a provision prohibiting the disclosure of information. There are two ways that things might get better. One requires some legislative or administrative action, and we're all familiar with the minimum necessary provision in the HIPAA privacy rule. What is not in the HIPAA privacy rule that I think ought to be, it should be minimum necessary in the least identifiable form consistent with the use. So no administrator, no processor of a health claim, no payer actually needs to know your name. All they need to know is your number 123, and number 123 is entitled to benefits under a certain system, and they can be linked and so forth. There's actually an economic trend that's going on that might actually make things better as well, and that is, we all remember years ago when you retired, you had a defined benefit program from your employer. Those are gone now. We all have defined contribution plans. There's some evidence that it's shifting in terms of health insurance as well, and I think that would help. The Affordable Care Act, by making individual health insurance more affordable, allows employers to say, we're going to give you $500 a month as a benefit. Do whatever you want with it in terms of buying health insurance. It gets them less involved for dollar like your self-insured employer was. And to the extent we do that and more companies go with that model, I think many of them feel they can limit their costs that way, and most don't realize that there's a privacy benefit to employees if we went in that direction.
I think I have just one last comment. As somebody mentioned, what can we do? First of all, Rita Graywell, Department of Veterans Affairs. I just have a comment saying, how do we address this issue? You bring up some very valid points, and those are things which really do happen out there. What I have found from my experience is the training and education, whether it's for CEOs, supervisors, managers, and HR. I think that training and education is key in making sure that those things don't happen, or at least minimizing, well, I didn't know whether I could, use this information or see this information, and have access to it. So I think training and education is the key for employees.
Excellent point. Thank you. Well, everyone, please thank Deanna for joining us today.